Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Scott, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Very good. We got a great announcement for our listeners.
Yeah, very excited about it.
Before we dive into this week's episode, we just want to announce a new development for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast. We've now created a YouTube channel.
Yes, we've grown up. We've come of age.
It's about time.
Yeah, about time. Well, that's another way to put it, I guess.
Many times over the past several years, it's been suggested that we should publish episodes on YouTube. And the reason that's always given is that it's going to increase our exposure to the algorithm, the social media algorithms, and all those web crawling bots that funnel certain kinds of content to specific audiences. And the idea being that this is going to increase our reach and our impact. And I've resisted it for a number of reasons. The biggest reason simply being the amount of time involved. But I've finally taken the bull by the horns. I've invested a solid week's worth of effort into repackaging almost half of our episodes and uploading them to our new YouTube channel. And Scott, you've seen them.
Yes, yeah, they look great. And I look forward to seeing how this pans out and if it does drive more listeners to the podcast.
Yeah. Now, once again, we've done this before, but once again, now that we're saying this about the YouTube channel, I need to call attention to the fact that there are a couple other podcasts that might be confused with ours. And so new listeners who hear about this great podcast that's now out there, and they just search for it by name, they might end up getting connected to a different one. So once again, here's the history. We started our podcast 5 years ago. We released the first episode at the very beginning of 2020. Basically, I took the blog site that I've been running for 7 years before that, since 2014, and I reconfigured it into a podcast. Within just a couple weeks, we had already released 7 episodes to create a solid beachhead, a footprint, as it were, and then we continued dropping individual episodes at a more reasonable pace, one every week. But around the same time, a couple things developed that make it necessary for me to tell this story. Again, we had started in January of 2020, Recovering Evangelicals, plural, and there was another podcast that started in 2020 as well called The New Evangelicals with Tim Whitaker. And then a third podcast launched in late 2021, a year and a half later, called The Recovering Evangelical podcast, singular here. So we are the Recovering Evangelicals, plural, and she is the Recovering Evangelical, singular. When she was releasing her first episodes, we were already into our third season. So from what I can tell, that third podcast, The Recovering Evangelical Singular, has now gone defunct. I say that because the latest episode available at iTunes is almost 2 years old, November 2023. And the sense I get is that she's morphed it into a vehicle or platform on TikTok. So if you want to find us, or if you're recommending us to a friend, and please do, you'll just need to discriminate between our Recovering Evangelicals podcast, plural, and Tim Whitaker's podcast, The New Evangelical Podcast. And the last thing I want to emphasize here has to do with monetization. We've never actively monetized this podcast. I haven't seen a single penny generated at any time during our 5 years on the web, neither for me personally nor for the podcast itself. And so our advertising and promotion department is non-existent. This is purely a labor of love that we share freely, and we depend entirely on our audience, word of mouth, to bring in new listeners. So please, if you like what we're doing, if you think we've created something useful, then please leave comments at our WordPress site or now at our YouTube channel. Like and share with friends and family. All of these things get noticed by the social media algorithms, and those will then amplify our podcast.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a really important point. When I often tell people about the podcast and some of the stats and stuff like that, their first thing is, why is it monetized? Is it monetized? Are you making money hand over fist or whatever? And I tell them, no, it isn't. And they're quite baffled often by that. But that's not the motivation that you have behind this. And I think it gives us a certain freedom that we might not have if we were monetized.
Absolutely. It's a matter of principle. I just don't want to do this and turn it into. I don't want the interviews interrupted with advertisements.
Right.
I just prefer not to. Okay. So then the only other thing that I do want to say, it's a matter of personal pride here. When you look at the hit rates on our YouTube channel, those are really misrepresentative of our presence on the web, the World Wide Web. When I release a new episode through our WordPress site, which is where iTunes and Spotify get it, and our subscribers get it from there as well, I'm used to seeing numbers in the thousands, but when you look at the hit rates at the new YouTube channel, which is only a couple weeks old, the numbers are like 2 or 20.
Yeah, I know.
It's demoralizing.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, that is one of the downsides of putting them up there.
Exactly. So it's going to take some time before the numbers really reflect our real status, and our listeners can play a key role, a critical role in helping us out there. So please like, comment, share, subscribe. That's how it works, folks.
Yeah.
Okay, so on with the main part of the show. We've got a great guest lined up, but let me first put this into context. We've often brought in various guests who simply tell their story of being a recovering evangelical. Someone who grew up in an evangelical context, often a very fundamentalist one, and they've since traveled far off that path into something that looks completely different. We've often referred to that as the slippery slope. Where they find themselves now looks completely not evangelical. It might not even be Christian. It might not even rank as a religious belief system at all. They may be atheists. And we don't do this to embarrass evangelicals or to simply gripe and complain. We do this because we think we can learn from each other. All of us have walked a journey and we can learn from each other. If we see that everyone keeps tripping over the same logs on that slippery slope, maybe it's time that we start removing those logs.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit, of course, the famous saying attributed to Einstein, who knows if it was him or not, about insanity, that keep doing things the same way and expecting different results. And when I look at the modern church in many respects, not just even the evangelical church, but just in general, that seems to often apply. We just keep kind of pounding away and ignoring the elephant in the room.
I think it needs to be said that a lot of people who leave evangelicalism aren't doing it for the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They're doing it because they've taken a good close look at it, a really close look at it. They've read tons of books, had many conversations, asked a lot of questions. In many cases, they even went to seminary, to Bible college, to dig down deep into it. And in the process of all that trying to figure it out, they found that evangelicalism just wasn't working for them anymore. They're like Dorothy, who looked behind the curtain and saw the truth about the wizard.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. I think your earlier point, too, that whenever I was questioning things and so on, I found from other believers that they kind of always revert back to kind of the moral argument. There's something wrong with me. I don't want to believe because I don't want to be held responsible. I don't want to believe that there's a judge. And it really trivializes your questions and makes it all about you instead of all about some of the real issues.
Exactly.
And so, and that makes it a more, I think, in many respects, a much more painful process. It adds to your consternation.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it needs to be said that this is true not only of your average Christians, but even the leaders within the evangelical movement, who they also end up losing it on the slippery slope. Recently, we wanted to talk to some of those leaders about their own personal experience, and so we talked to John James Kirkwood, a pastor at an evangelical church, and to Peter Enns, a theologian and professor at an evangelical college. And in both cases, they were leading large groups of people who wanted to be evangelical, even to become leaders in the evangelical movement, while John and Peter themselves were questioning and rejecting so much of evangelicalism because it just wasn't working for them anymore. And we talked to Dr. Christian Smith about how that old-time religion isn't working anymore. It's become obsolete, he said. Not becoming obsolete, but it went obsolete.
Yeah, he had a very particular and pretty nuanced understanding of what that means, obsolete. And I thought that was very interesting, that what he's really saying is that the culture has shifted so much, and the fact that the church in general has not tracked with those, it has become, I would almost say, irrelevant,
Right.
And so I thought that was a very interesting discussion.
Yeah. He emphasized that the word obsolete doesn't mean useless. It's still very useful, but to a smaller and smaller group of people.
Right.
And he used the example of the electric typewriter. I use the example of vinyl records. There are people who still buy vinyl records. They will only buy vinyl records. They swear by it, but they're getting fewer and fewer. I made the point in that episode about how so many you and I, Scott, and many of our listeners grew up in a home where everyone went to church. The family went to church every Sunday, sometimes several times a week. And now we have all raised kids ourselves who don't go to church. And those kids who don't go to church are going to have kids. Those kids are certainly not going to go to church. So the demographics for Christian groups is going to dwindle. That's inevitable.
I agree. And it's kind of interesting, too, to me that in my growing up years, I mean, I've mentioned before, we went to a very, what you would call today, progressive church. In fact, probably more progressive than many non-evangelical churches today. We had a minister who was quite liberal, but we still got up every Sunday and got dressed up and went to church. There was a cultural Christianity, right? And so did most of our neighbors. Cultural Christianity has been dying and is close to dead now. And so that's having a big impact, I think, on all kinds of things that hasn't been maybe noted as much as it should be. So even though people didn't necessarily, quote, believe or weren't necessarily, quote, evangelical, there was still this embedded cultural kind of Christianity that gave coherence, social coherence. For example, my parents' friends pretty much all came from that church environment. And so I think that's something that really, maybe we could even someday explore that even further, what we've lost, I guess.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'm going to say about what we learned from Dr. Christian Smith, because we do have another guest we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Christian Smith talked about what's on the horizon, and we did get him to say some things about that, but he really didn't want to say too much because he's now writing the book on that one. But we heard from Christian what he's seeing coming on the horizon. Basically, the kids who are not now going to church, and they themselves are going to raise their own kids who don't grow up in a Christian environment, but they do have a spirituality. You know, we have this phrase, spiritual but not religious. And it's a complex mixture of all kinds of things, you know, New Age, astrology, the universe, the law of attraction, tarot cards, a whole different world, a whole different perspective that those kids are going to be coming in with. And it's something that the church has just not ever wrestled with. I mean, yes, we've talked about New Age ideas and what have you, but now we're talking about a zeitgeist that's drenched in these things.
Well, I think we saw that a lot during COVID as well, is that kind of exacerbated that whole thing. I think it was kind of laying there sleeping. And now that people were isolated and we were facing a tragedy, it really came out, you know, and the crazy ideas and the conspiracy theories and stuff like that I don't think, like during the first plague or the earlier plague in the beginning of the 19th century, the Spanish, so-called Spanish flu, I got to think that there wasn't the same attitude about, you know, conspiracies. And, you know, of course, in those days, they didn't have vaccines, but you know what I mean? I think it was just, totally. It was a disease, and they had to do what they could to not get it and isolate. And it's bizarre in the modern world.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a new guest.
Yeah.
We talked previously to John James Kirkwood and Peter Enns and Christian Smith. We're going to add another Christian leader who also walked that slippery slope and has a story to tell. We're going to hear from Brian McLaren. We've had Brian on twice before already, 3 years ago, to talk about how doing church needs to be done differently post-COVID. That was episode number 53. And then last year we had him on with his most recent book, Life After Doom, Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. That was episode number 148. And we'll explain more about that when we bring him on. But first, let's just talk about his credentials and why we think it's worth bringing him on for a third time. He has been a college English professor and then a pastor of a very successful evangelical church and assisted in the development of several new churches, and during that time became a prolific author, a couple dozen titles to his name. We'll hear about them. He's a popular speaker and a guest lecturer for denominational and ecumenical leadership gatherings across the U.S. and Canada, Latin America, Europe, Africa, and Asia. He's a frequent guest on TV, on radio, and news media programs. He's an activist, a culture warrior, and a Jesus freak. In 2015, McLaren was named by Time magazine as one of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. But he's also been on a spiritual journey, reevaluating many of the Christian beliefs he once had. So he too is a recovering evangelical, and he's here in the podcast studio once again.
Yes, welcome, Brian.
Great to be with you.
You've got a new book coming out, and the last time we had you on a year ago, You surprised us by having done a 90-degree pivot, a turn in the kind of writing that we'd come to expect into an entirely new direction. Instead of writing about your search for a more meaningful spirituality and building heaven on earth, your latest book at that time, Life After Doom, was about how we're destroying the planet and creating hell on earth. And now, 1 year later, you're making another 90-degree pivot into a completely different plane. Instead of an update on our destruction of the planet or trying to save it and build heaven on earth, this one's about humans abandoning spaceship Earth and colonizing Mars. This is a novel. It's a trilogy, in fact.
Mm. Well, yeah. Well, first, let me say the book last year, Life After Doom, I hope you don't mind me sharing this. I just found out last night it won a Nautilus Award, which is a big honor in the publishing world.
Well-deserved.
And really, I'll just make a connection. I think you're right. It looked like a big turn, but I think you can also see the connection with what I'd done before. I had a big theological shift 20 years ago when I realized that Jesus' central message was this thing he called the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God was not primarily about where you go after you die, but it's, well, in the Lord's Prayer, we say, may your kingdom come, may your will be done on earth. It was about this earth, which then made me ask, well, if God cares about this earth, shouldn't I? And what's going on in the earth? And so I wrote a book back at that time called Everything Must Change. And the book Life After Doom was my sort of coming back to that question, what's going on in this world and where are we? And so that book was about the polycrisis, which is this combination of crises where each one makes the others harder to solve. And before I started writing Life After Doom, I'd been working on this novel and this trilogy of novels. The first in the trilogy is called The Last Voyage. And what I was trying to do in these novels, which are science fiction, is I was trying to imagine a future very different from the one we're used to. And you can see how that makes sense. If the present that we've created is unsustainable into the future, we have to imagine a different kind of future. I use the idea of a voyage to Mars for a couple of reasons, but I should make it clear. It's not because I think that's a good idea or even because I think it would work. One little thing for anybody who does research into this subject that you find out is one key difference between Mars and the Earth, besides not having any liquid water and not having much of an atmosphere, is that Mars does not have magnetic field. It doesn't. We have a North Pole and a South Pole. Mars doesn't. And as a result, it has no radiation shield, which means that Mars is irradiated by solar energy and by all the cosmic rays coming from distant galaxies and stars. So it's not a great place to go on vacation, right? But for generations, Mars has represented a kind of fresh start for our species. And I wanted to play with that idea in the midst of all the challenges we're dealing with right now.
And any references in the book to Total Recall?
No, but no references. But yeah, but that's another example. I mean, it goes back. There's a little known book by Fyodor Dostoevsky where he actually imagines a trip to Mars back in the 1800s. So yeah, this is a long-standing thing. And we add to the intrigue of it with people like Elon Musk, who, I mean, he must be somewhat of a smart guy to make all the money he's made, although the way he talks about going to Mars makes it sound like he doesn't know that much about it. It's a little bit strange, you know. So at any rate, yeah.
Do you think Musk doesn't say too much because he doesn't want to scare people or because he doesn't want to betray how much he doesn't know?
Well, he started by saying we were going to go there. I forget what year it was going to be. He has to keep moving it back. So I think as time goes on, he's becoming better apprised of the difficulties and challenges. Bottom line is that the more you learn about colonizing Mars, the more you think we better take care of this Earth. That's just a given.
Do you think John F. Kennedy was aware of that when he made his announcement?
Of going to the moon?
Yeah.
You know, I don't think he ever thought we would be able to colonize the moon. Maybe he did, but I think his goal was to land a person on the moon. And I suppose short-term stays on the moon, we've already shown that's possible.
Right.
The trip to Mars is so much farther. A good estimate would be it would take 9 months of travel to get to Mars. So you think 9 months to get there, 9 months to get back, or 18 months if you only stay one day. And
Right.
that's a long time to be in weightlessness and space, all kinds of impacts for the human body. But it is a fascinating thing to imagine, both for its technological challenges, but even more for the more human challenges
Right.
of how we get along with one another, how we get along with ourselves, and what we really understand human beings to be.
Right.
We have this kind of idea that we exist apart from this planet, which is our home. And that's one of the things I hope that the book will get people thinking about.
Right. So you said that trip to Mars would be very hard on the body, but there's also the mind, and you kind of hinted at that. How we have to learn how to get along. Did you read in the news that story? There's a number of guys who are based, I think they're all guys, but anyhow, people based at that Antarctica base,
Yes.
and one of them started to show signs of not being very good to get along with.
Back, I forget what year this was, but in the previous century, there were a couple of experiments where they put people in a sphere and in a kind of a greenhouse to be in a self-contained unit and help people understand that. And those experiments, the psychological challenges proved every bit as great as the
Right.
technological challenges for many reasons. But they had some very memorable language to describe what happens to people when they're stuck with each other. One of the terms was a behavioral sink. Like we start going down the drain in our ability to get along.
And that's even when they knew, at the story that you're talking about, that they knew it was just a very quick, probably a less than 10-minute elevator ride back to the surface.
Yeah.
But going to Mars, it's probably
Yes.
going to be a one-way trip for a lot of people.
Well, in fact, that's one of the in this story, The Last Voyage. There's a series of voyages that are launched from the Earth. Everyone who goes is not coming back. There is no return voyage. So it's all one-way trips for people who are hoping to establish what biologists would call an assurance colony, if not only of humans, but of other life from Earth, because of the growing fear in this fictional story in the future that we humans may make this planet less and less habitable.
Wow. So this sounds like quite a shift, becoming a novelist, writing a novel, and all that entails. I'm just curious if that is a cathartic kind of exercise, that is a break from what you've done, or is it just another way that you're trying to promote ideas you've also promoted up to here in a nonfiction sense, and just another vehicle for that?
So that's a great question. I wrote 3 books in the early 2000s, another trilogy that were fictional. It was called A New Kind of Christian, and the second was The Story We Find Ourselves In. The third was The Last Word and the Word After That. And the story of how I came to write those was kind of interesting. When my first book came out, it was called The Church on the Other Side. Someone said, if McLaren really means what he's saying about that we're in a shift from a modern to a postmodern culture, he should be writing poetry and plays and novels and so on, because what we understand going forward is we don't just need new ideas, we need new ways of thinking. We need new ways of imagining. And that's in many ways what gave me the courage to try to write fiction over 20 years ago. And I always hoped that I would come back to it. I started writing The Last Voyage really for my own mental health. And now I think I understand a little more why. When we start to see that we've got some hard times ahead, I think all of our brains don't want to hold that reality that we have hard times ahead. So what we tend to do is we either deny it and just pretend as if it's not true and go on with our lives so that our normalcy isn't interrupted. Or we just surrender to it and say, there's no hope. Interestingly, if you say there's no problem and there's no hope, you end up at the same place. There's nothing I need to do, right? And I have felt neither of those places, there's no problem and there's no hope, makes me a better person. They make me more complacent, sort of going with the flow. And in a sense, I stop being a protagonist in my own story. I just am adjusting, but I'm not playing a role. So I realize now when you accept, when you become convinced that we're facing some hard times because our current way of doing life in the way we get along with the earth and with each other is not sustainable, and more of us are coming to realize that, then we need to be able to imagine what could be better on the other side of this current struggle. And science fiction is one of the ways that we both try to warn ourselves about what's going on and where that will lead. And we try to imagine what could a better way of life look like.
Okay. We will talk more about your book at the end of this episode, but if you don't mind, Brian, I'd like to now jump to actually the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about. Not the book, but the author of this book. Your journey, the journey that you've been on for 3 or 4 decades. We've often profiled one or another of our listeners, asking them to tell their story and their journey out of evangelicalism. And sometimes they found a new form of faith, sometimes a non-Christian form of faith, or sometimes they found an agnostic or even in some cases an atheistic worldview. And we've probably done a dozen of those. And we do them because we think our listeners are there's something there for our listeners to relate to. We've all been on this journey. And it's good for them to know that they're not alone.
Yes.
A lot of them will comment in the letters to us or in comments on the website. They'll say that they thought they were the only one on this path.
Yes.
And so we wanted to make the point that, no, this is common. And more recently, I thought we should let our listeners know that this is not just common amongst, the rank and file Christians, the ones sitting in the pews, but it's also something that our leaders, Christian leaders, go through. And so a few weeks ago, we talked to a person, John James Kirkwood, who was a pastor of a church, a Christian nationalist church, actually, during the years that he himself made his way out of that form of evangelicalism. Just a couple weeks ago, we talked to Peter Enns, the guy who's a podcaster by night, the Bible for Normal People, but a theologian and university professor by day, about his journey out of traditional evangelicalism. One of the things I asked him was, what's it like to be a professor teaching students who are fully evangelical and wanting to serve in an evangelical church, but you yourself have so much questions about all of that. So now we want to talk to you, Brian, about your journey, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So before we can talk about your journey into a new spirituality, we need to talk about where it all began, the Christianity of your childhood. I've heard this term, spiritual formation. Your roots are Brethren, right?
Yes, that's right. So I was born in 1956, right in the middle of the century, just before the peak of the baby boom. And, none of us get a choice of where we're born. I could have been born in a Muslim country and I would have been in a Muslim family. I was born in a committed Christian family in the Plymouth Brethren tradition. The Brethren were a sort of a late reform movement. You could think of it in terms of Martin Luther was trying to reform Catholicism, and different Calvinists, in a sense, didn't want to stop where Luther stopped. They wanted to reform it in additional ways. And then Baptists want to reform it. The Anabaptist Mennonites want to reform it even more. And after all of those reforms, the Brethren came along in the 1830s, and they had another set of reforms that they believed in. They grew out of primarily Anglican clergy. By the time I came along, Plymouth Brethren were known for biblical literalism. They were very, very focused on the Bible and taking the Bible literally. And that was really my first run-in with my inheritance. Any kid who grows up, whatever you grow up, it's normal for you. You can't imagine anything else. But I remember, because I loved to read and I loved science, I thought evolution made so much sense. And I loved the outdoors, and I was interacting with, animals and plants all the time. And when I understood that my religious community did not look favorably upon evolution and really was a bit suspicious about science in general, I remember thinking, this isn't going to work for me. There were other things that came up as well, but that was kind of the first chink in the armor. Yeah.
I heard you tell that in one of your, it was a talk you gave, a Theo Ed talk about your journey out of fundamentalism. I'll come back to that theme, fundamentalism, but in that Theo Ed talk, you mentioned how you were all of 12 years old, and that's when you had declared you had had enough of fundamentalism. Maybe tell that story.
Yeah. Well, I sometimes say it was because of facts, sex, and rock and roll. Facts, because it looked to me like evolution made a lot of sense, and I was not allowed to even consider it. I had a Sunday school teacher tell me, you make a choice. You either believe in God or evolution, but not both. Sex came in because, to be a boy entering adolescence, it just felt like the obsession with sex was not a healthy thing. I just remember looking at myself and other people and saying, we're human beings, we're sexual beings, and we're made to feel guilty about every sexual thought. I just thought this isn't what this is doing to me is not good. And I don't think it's good for other people. Of course, later that became intensified when one of my close friends came out as gay, and he was one of the nicest, kindest, warmest people. And I knew that my religious tradition was going to call him an abomination. And he came from a similar background. And I watched the psychological struggle that he was experiencing. And then rock and roll. I played in a band. I love music. I love the arts. And there's something about the arts, whether it's, rock and roll or literature. I later became a college English teacher, so I love literature, that explores life with honesty. And it's not just make everything fit in some accepted little grid, but face the messy and the dirty and and try to face all the reality that you can.
Right. The listeners can't see, but behind you on your wall is it's a wall full of guitars and I think a piano there. Do I see a keyboard?
There's a keyboard over here. Yeah.
And do you still play? Are you still in a band?
No, I'm not in a band anymore, but I still write music and I love music. Yeah.
Very good. So fundamentalism, I did want to come back to that. You said that you referred to at least a couple aspects of their fundamentalism, the anti-evolution and that sort of thing. But what about other things like Young Earth Creationism, literal Bible, literal, Israelites walking out of Egypt, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I think what happens to me, it's kind of like you're given this contract and the contract requires you believe in all those things. And then you start to make little provisos or a little addenda to the contract. Well, I know everybody believes this, but I don't accept that. I'm still good with the rest of it. Well, now I'm not good with the second thing. And now I'm not good with the third. And eventually you reach the point where you think, I have more addenda to the contract than the contract itself. And you start to think maybe there is something wrong with this whole framework.
Right.
And that I don't think I fully faced that possibility until I was already a young pastor. And I'd been involved with helping start a new congregation. I'd left teaching where I was working at a university. And I was now a pastor. And I remember a day when I just thought, you know what? I can't patch this up anymore. I'm not sure how much I don't believe, but I'm sure it goes deeper than just these little individual things. There's something deeper here that no longer rings true.
And we're going to hear about that in a few minutes, that slippery slope. But the other thing I heard in your Theo Ed talk, I think this was still in your childhood stage, and that's why I want to get back to this. You mentioned about a hilltop experience. It was very pivotal for you. Was that also, I think you were in your teens?
I was. I was in my teens. And what had happened actually is our little denomination, we didn't have a youth group. We didn't have youth retreats or anything like that. But a friend of mine went to a church that did, and he asked me if I wanted to go on a retreat. And he told me that two young ladies who I was very interested in were both going to be there. And so I can't say I went as a spiritual seeker. I went more for social reasons. And at this retreat, they invited us to take an hour to be alone and to go outdoors, find a place, and they invited us to pray. Well, growing up in a fundamentalist setting, we prayed before every meal. We prayed all the time. But it was interesting. I remember thinking that day, what do I really want in life? And I'm not even sure I believe there's a God already, at this point. But it was interesting, the act of admitting to myself, I'm not sure I believe, but I do wonder what I really want. And I sorted all that out in that hour and just sort of left it. And that was it. And then later that night, to be perfectly honest, a couple of friends and I made an agreement that we would sneak out and meet up outside. And while we were outside on that hillside, I pulled away from my friends and sat by myself again. And I just had this sense that whatever God was love. And that love was not just for me, but it was for every person, and not just every person, but for the grass and the trees. And there's a barbed wire fence and cows on the other side of the fence where I was. And I just felt the belovedness of everything. And it was very very significant moment in my life.
And again, this was at night, so I'm imagining there was a lot of stars.
Really a beautiful, clear night. Yes.
Yeah. And so we did a couple episodes roughly a year ago talking about awe, the
Yes.
spiritual experience of awe and how it puts you in a frame to be open, to be receptive, to be introspective. So that must have been a play here.
Absolutely. This sense of the grandeur and magnificence and huge size, at the same time a feeling of intimacy that it's not like I was thinking I'd love to have an experience of transcendence and intimacy, but it's what happened. And the fact that it happened outside of my denomination on this retreat and outdoors, I think they were a special gift to me because, in a sense, that track of my life had a life of its own from that point on.
Right.
So, Brian, our lives have been kind of parallel paths in a lot of ways. We're similar age, and I can identify with the experience you've just been mentioning, this kind of hilltop experience and so on. I was also kind of quite caught up in the whole Jesus movement of the late 70s and early 80s, and was wondering if that was a factor for you as well.
Yeah, I forget exactly the timing, but right around that same time, I got invited to this gathering in the Washington, D.C. area that I went to, and it was the first time I was exposed to charismatic phenomena and also a lot of people my age who liked rock and roll music, which was now fundamentalists love rock and roll, but back then it was pianos and organs, and that was it. And and what was amazing for me, I mean, later I felt the Jesus movement. I don't know to what degree this was just that I had a misperception at the beginning, but I felt it got taken over by more kind of a conservative political movement. But in those days, what felt liberating about it was, look, this isn't about white shirts and ties and wingtip shoes, and it's not about pianos and organs. It's actually about this guy, Jesus, and he was a pretty radical person who stood for peace and love and joy and those things. So that gave me a space to re-explore what Jesus was really about. Now, I still kept all of the traditional doctrines that I'd been given. I began to nuance them. And then later, over time, I rethought those things as well.
So let me ask, were you more of a Larry Norman fan or a Keith Green fan?
Well, when I first, in those days, Keith Green wasn't even on the scene yet. So Larry Norman had a new album that had come out called Only Visiting This Planet. That was the first Christian record I ever listened to. So I was a big Larry Norman fan. Yeah.
Okay, so then you started thinking about what you were going to do with your life, a whole career path, and you did go to university. You got a couple degrees, a couple graduate degrees, but not for a career as a church leader, as I understand it.
It's interesting. I look back and try to remember what was going on in my mind. My interest was literature, and I think because in church, you have this amazing piece of literature that you're not allowed to treat as literature. You have to treat it as something else. But literature in an English department or in an English class it's not about telling you what you have to think. It's giving you freedom to think. It's stimulating your imagination, and it's inviting you to find meaning and engage in meaning making with other people. So in some ways, I think literature did for me what religion was supposed to do, but very often didn't do. So yeah, that was my major. And I'm still working in the field of literature. Years later, when I finally found permission to let the Bible be what it was, which is an incredible collection of literature. When I let it be literature, it actually became more interesting to me than it had been before and more valuable to me.
So when you were there, I'm still in the university stage, and You're talking about how you had already given up a few theological tenets and ideas. And you're now doing a degree in literature. You mentioned about this amazing document that we have as Christians that we're not supposed to treat as literature. So there's my question. To what extent were you still struggling with what you'd been given as a child, that this is a document dropped out of heaven, basically a monologue from God directly, versus this is a document put together by humans and you have to weave your way through it to understand what it's saying?
Yes. So I graduated high school in 1974. And right around that time, a group of evangelicals came together and wrote something called the Lausanne Covenant. And a lot of people don't understand this today because really evangelical and fundamentalists today are virtually indistinguishable. In many ways, fundamentalists won and got control of the vast majority of evangelicalism as I understand it. But back in those days, when you were a fundamentalist and you entered into these larger evangelical spaces, you found more freedom. And I remember that document, the Lausanne document, gave me a lot of freedom. For example, it talked about the importance of social justice. There was one paragraph about social justice. Well, what I did is I latched on to any little thing like that I could find in the evangelical world that gave me permission to see the Bible in fresh ways. And it invited me to stop being so obsessed with words like inerrancy, which was such a big word. So that was a first step. Of course, I think later the Lausanne group probably tightened up and became more fundamentalistic too. But yeah, I felt that freed me up to see that there were multiple ways of interpreting the Bible. And at some point, you don't have to argue about inerrancy. You can just argue about different interpretations. And then that led me to be able to ask deeper and deeper questions about the Bible.
Okay, so then after having gotten a degree in literature and being an English professor, you became a pastor. What was behind this?
So when my wife and I got married, I was in graduate school and I had a teaching fellowship. So I was teaching freshman comp to undergraduates while I was doing my own studies. My wife was a high school teacher. And I would meet somebody on campus and say, hey, come on over for dinner. And at one point, my wife said, would you stop inviting people over for dinner so often? I'm getting home from school. I'm tired. She said, let's make a deal. Let's invite people over one night a week. And so I can't remember. I think it was Monday nights. We said, okay, that's a night that we'll consider inviting people over. So that little gathering around the table, we started saying, hey, we're inviting some more people next week. And that grew into a little fellowship group. We didn't really think we were starting a church at that point. It was just a fellowship group. But then that grew and one thing led to another. It became a little congregation.
So when was that that you became a pastor? What years?
Yeah. So in about, we got married in 79. So in 1980 and 81, we were having these dinner groups. And in 82, we formed this little congregation. At first, we just called it Community Church. And eventually it became Cedar Ridge Community Church. And I was part of that for 24 years.
Probably now's the good time just to start to talk about where you, in addition to being a pastor, you started to become a prolific author. And I want to go through the books because the titles convey the path that you were on. Mm-hmm. So it was around this time that you started writing many, many books that documented the milestones along your path of deconstruction. And maybe we should talk a bit about what does that word mean. But more importantly, your reconstruction, how you were coming to a new understanding. And I know that you're very familiar with the titles, but I want to read out the names of a dozen of them. I'll pick and choose the title versus the subtitle for the sake of our audience in the order that they were published to capture that trajectory that you've been on. So if you'll indulge me then. First, there's a number of titles that map out you searching for something better. In 2006, the title is The Secret Message of Jesus, Uncovering the Truth That Could Change Everything, as if that truth had been hidden. Another book, A Generous Orthodoxy, Why I Am an Emergent Unfinished Christian. I've shortened the subtitle there. Finding Faith, A Search for What is Real. Another book a few years later, Finding Our Way Again. Then, as you mentioned, A New Kind of Christianity. Another book, the story we find ourselves in, The Further Adventures of a New Kind of Christian. We Make the Road by Walking, a year-long quest for spiritual formation, reorientation, and activation. Another book, The Great Spiritual Migration, How the World's Largest Religion is Seeking a Better Way to be a Christian. Daily Reflections on a New Way to Experience and Practice the Christian Faith. And that's as of the year 2017, but it seems that around that point, you're really dealing with the darker side of this slippery slope. So a title, Faith After Doubt, Why Your Beliefs Stopped Working and What to Do About It. And then a title, Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned. So these are all mapping out your journey. Brian, you want to tell us about that?
Sure. Well, maybe just to make a connection to back when I was studying literature in university, back in the 70s, what we now call postmodern philosophy was first entering the American Academy, and it came in through English departments, and especially through literary criticism. How do we read literary texts? And I remember two things. First, I found that fascinating, what they were talking about. And I felt it was highly relevant to reading the Bible. But I also remember thinking, if this way of thinking catches on, the Christian religion is in a heap of trouble. Because this isn't just offering different answers to old questions. This is asking all new questions,
Right.
very new questions in very different ways. And so I had been exposed to this in the mid 70s. And then I was a pastor through the 80s. But in the early 90s, I remember feeling the people who are coming through the doors of my church, they're in this new way of thinking. And the answers that I was taught to the questions they're asking will not work for them at all. So that, in a sense, created my own spiritual crisis. It made me then say, if I say to other people what people said to me, I will feel dishonest and cheap, and I'll just feel like I'm a bad leader. I'm a bad human being. I'm like a doctor writing bogus prescriptions. It just doesn't feel right. So from 1990 through 1994, one of my 4 children was going through chemotherapy, and thankfully he survived and came through fine. But those were rough years. And when you have a beloved child with cancer, the easy answers that you got in a lot of Christian settings, you just know this doesn't work. What they say is supposed to happen doesn't work. And I felt that the spirituality that many of my fellow Christians came to me to try to help me with just made things worse. You know, whether it was claiming a healing or whatever else, it just was not helping. And what that did is, in a sense, push me farther in the mid 90s to say, this thing isn't working. This whole thing. Obviously, it's working for a lot of people, but for a lot of people like me, it's not working anymore. So that was really the pivotal moment. And I wrote my first book as an attempt to try to be honest about what I felt wasn't working and what I felt needed to change so that we could get to a better place.
And what you've just said, this is what I was also getting at when we spoke to Peter Enns a couple of weeks ago. The whole idea that he was leading students, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed students who wanted to be pastors, evangelical pastors, and teach evangelical ideas, and yet Pete himself was wrestling with a lot of the fundamental tenets and creeds and practices of evangelicalism. So, Brian, you've just told the same sort of thing from your point of view. That must be really hard to lead a church.
Yeah, I would try to be honest with people in my sermons, and sometimes people would get upset, but interestingly, other people would be so grateful. And a really pivotal moment came in the history of both my life and that church when one of the leaders of our little congregation, we were about to go away on a leadership retreat. And he said, hey, at this retreat, we need to put this on the agenda. We need to talk about whether this is just your journey, something you should deal with and keep it separate from your job with us, or whether we're all on this journey together. And I said to him, please don't bring that up. Partly, I think, because I thought it will not go well. And partly because I said, we got a lot on our plate. And without that will blow up the whole agenda. Of course, he did not listen to me as a good friend and leader that he was. And he brought it up. And to my surprise, our whole little leadership group said, no, this is our journey too. We're all in this together. Now, that didn't mean things got easy, but it did mean I didn't get fired for asking questions. But I had to, in a sense, work this out for myself, but also see my congregation as a place of helping other people be on this journey.
And that must have been incredibly, it must have given you a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, that's a good word for it, because anytime I preach, I didn't want to say things I didn't believe, and I didn't want to say things I didn't mean. But I also didn't want to freak out people with more than they could handle. And so, and I think just about every pastor, religious leader, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, or whatever, goes through this. How can I be honest and not disrupt people unnecessarily? And so, yeah, that was a struggle. And some people were so grateful, and they think about that church as the best church experience of their lives. And other people, when they left, they thought, I hate these people. I hate what they're doing. They're infidels and things like that. So they were very happy to leave.
And that too was part of John's story. John Kirkwood mentioned as well that he was leading essentially what was at that time a Christian nationalist church, yes, when John was revisiting a lot of the things that he believed and didn't believe anymore. And part of his story was all these congregants who were leaving, many in anger, many in fear.
They were running out of the way of the thunderbolt that was going to hit John.
Oh my goodness. As you say that, of course, because I wrote about this, I had so many people contact me when they were in the middle of these tumultuous transitions. And so, over the last 20 years, I can't guess how many pastors I've talked to. But I remember one fellow, he went public to his congregation that he said, I used to teach that being gay was a sin and others. I no longer believe that anymore. And I would like our congregation to welcome everyone with the same wide open arms. And he had a mega church, and thousands of people left. And when I saw him maybe a year and a half later, I said, how are you doing? And he said, we're a lot smaller, but we've never been better. But it's traumatic. And each one of those people who leaves takes a little chunk, because usually they have to throw in a little barb. And it's understandable. They feel betrayed. They feel like they bought one product and the product line changed.
As I've been listening to you, Brian, I can just 100% identify with what you're saying, because I went through exactly the same thing. I was only pastoring a very small church, so it wasn't maybe as dramatic as yourself. There weren't that many people involved, but there were enough. And I went through that same, the mental gyrations, of they're paying me to deliver a certain product. There's that sense, right?
Yeah.
But I don't feel I can deliver that product quite the same. The
Yes.
product's changed, and so they started to sense that. And then kind of like yourself, kind of hit it head on, lost some folks. And it was a very painful experience, especially the ones you lose that it isn't bitter in a sense, like you were
Yes.
good friends, and
Yes.
and yet now all of a sudden there's a feeling you can't be. It's just so sad.
Yes, that's right. And people don't understand that good pastors are sensitive people. So each one of those departures wounds them a little bit. And it's a wonder that folks survive. But I've seen so many go through that, and they come through, maybe wounded, but I think of that phrase Henry Nouwen would use, the wounded healer. They come through even more gracious and understanding. But it ain't easy, as you know.
Well, I had the one advantage that at the time my income wasn't totally depending on it, and I really feel for people
Yes.
in those situations where their livelihood depends on
Yes.
their belief system. And
That's right.
that's a very difficult thing to navigate.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so Brian, there's so many other things that we wanted to ask you, but long list and not a lot of time. The one that I do want to have our listeners hear from you is where you're at this point in your faith journey. You've come a long way since fundamentalism.
Yes. Well, one of the things that happened to me in the process of writing books is you have to think deeply, about what it is you're trying to say. And when it goes in print and lots of people read it, you have to really be sure that's what you want to say. And it's funny, I came across a verse in the New Testament along the way that it had been there all along, but it sort of shined in importance to me. And it's from Paul's letter to the Galatians. And he says, the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. The only thing that matters is faith expressing itself in love. And first of all, he doesn't say the only thing that matters is doctrine, or the only thing that matters is correctness, or the only thing that matters is certainty. The only thing that matters is faith. And I see faith as being an orientation to what we know and what we don't know, to the little that we can feel really certain of and the many things that go beyond us. So faith as opposed to beliefs, expressing itself in love. And what that has done for me, I don't think that verse gave me that permission. It's a place I'd arrived already, but it made me realize, you know what, maybe this is what Paul was really about more than anything else, if he said these words. And maybe this is what Jesus was about. And then you sort of realize, well, for example, the Dalai Lama says, look, my real religion is compassion. I happen to be a Tibetan Buddhist, but my real religion is compassion. And you find out that at the center of every tradition, there are people who center down on a few very deep, bottomless wells of meaning and practice. And I'm a Christian. It's my heritage. But for me, I inhabit that contemplative space in the Christian faith that is focused on faith expressing itself in love.
Okay. Any final words, Brian, that you might have for listeners who are going through the whole doubt and giving up ideas of faith and whether to continue believing or not, but maybe even more specifically to pastors? Some of our listeners are pastors who are going through this. Any words of advice?
You know, when I was going through this, I remember I went to see a therapist for the second time in my life. And I said, the reason I need to talk to you is because I don't know what I want and I don't know what I think. I know what other people want me to want, and I know what other people want me to think. And this person says, well, I have a special rate for clergy. I said, charge me your top rate. I don't want a bargain. I want somebody whose job it is to actually help me get in touch with because everybody else has an agenda for my life, right? And the thing I would say to folks is, you are a human being. Even if you're a pastor, you're still a human being. And you have the right to be honest, and you have the right to face what it is that you see. And nobody else might give you that right now. But I'm pretty sure the three of us here, we want people to have that, to understand that's part of their birthright. That's part of their dignity. And just because it's religious people who have an agenda for you, it doesn't mean it's a divine agenda. So I hope that would be of help to people. Okay.
All right. So let's then bring it back to your book that is coming out. It hasn't come yet. It comes, I think, late July is when it first comes in print. Is this book part of that journey?
Very much so.
We kind of touched on that. Why don't you continue that then?
Yeah. Something I didn't say about the book is that the occasion, the sort of inciting incident in the book is that this colony gets established on Mars, and then the colony begins to disintegrate. People are not doing well on the colony. And
Lord of the Flies.
Kind of that sort of thing. And the organizers back on Earth realize they've faced all the technical problems successfully, but they haven't dealt with the human element. And so they send one last voyage. And on this voyage, they include a theologian, ethicist, and a couple of poets and musicians. And they realize they have to have people who will help them pay attention to the human element. And this, I think, is very much where we're at in our culture. We have political systems, economic systems, all kinds of technology, but we're still dealing with the human element. And we know we need some work there. Well, some of us do. Some of us do.
And another question that I would ask at this point is, are there other books on the horizon? But I know this is the first in a trilogy.
That's right. Yeah. This one's called The Last Voyage, and the next one, which is already done, but it'll come out in, I guess, 2026, is called The Great Rift. And then the last one is called Ethnogenesis. So that's the plan.
Okay, Brian, thanks so much for giving us of your time. I know that you are busy, and I know that we need to wrap things up.
Sorry about that, guys.
No.
Well, can I just say thank you guys for keeping these conversations going, and for all the listeners. I'm so glad that they have you and your podcast, and I'm glad that you're creating a space for them.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you again. Look forward to next time.
Thank you, Brian. You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.